From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana, Siddiqui. First, the headlines. Putin tells Russian security is not negotiable as U.S. sends forces. U.S. law firm seeks action against Indian chief minister for extrajudicial killings. Supreme Court rejects Trump request to withhold information from January 6 committee. Toronto teacher sues Israel lobby group. UN slams unethical marketing of baby formula. OUTBACK mosques, the CAMELEERS who brought Islam to Australia. Dubai opens Museum of the Future. Our top story tonight. The United States will send air and ground forces to back NATO's eastern flank, a senior defense official said Tuesday. The move comes amid the threat of a further Russian invasion of Ukraine. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered the forces. They will move within the U.S. European Command Area of Operations to NATO's northeastern and southeastern flanks in the coming days. The U.S. has more than 90,000 troops already in Europe on rotational and permanent orders. President Vladimir Putin has insisted that Russia's interests and security are non-negotiable amid reports of more Russian troops moving closer towards Ukraine's borders. Mr. Putin gave a video address hours after U.S. President Joe Biden warned of the beginning of a Russian invasion. He said Russia was always open for direct and honest dialogue, but he had full confidence in the military. U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders on Tuesday called for the U.S. and its allies to impose heavy sanctions on Russian President Vladimir Putin. The independent senator from Vermont condemned Moscow's escalating military aggression toward Ukraine. Sanders' remarks came after U.S. President Joe Biden and leaders in the UK and the European Union moved to impose new economic sanctions on Russia. The Kremlin deployed troops into 2 breakaway territories in eastern Ukraine, which Putin formally recognized as independent on Monday. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump called Putin's recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics smart and pretty savvy. A special segment is coming up later tonight in our show, so keep watching Muslim News. A group of international criminal and human rights lawyers has filed a formal submission with the U.S. government seeking sanctions against Indian Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath of the state of Uttar Pradesh, or UP. The sanctions sought are for Adityanath's alleged role in extrajudicial killings committed by the state's police between 2017 and 2021. The submission was filed February 9th with the U.S. Departments of State and Treasury. It also recommends sanctions against Om Prakash Singh, the recently retired Director General of UP Police, and Sanjeev Tyagi, Police Superintendent for the District of Kanpur. The U.S.'s Global Magnitsky Act allows the Treasury Department to sanction individuals if they are responsible for, complicit in, or engaged with serious human rights abuse. That includes extrajudicial killings, rape, torture, or enforced disappearances. Michigan State Representative Abraham AIYASH on Monday spoke about the intersection of Black and Muslim identities in America at Rackham Graduate School in Ann Arbor. AIYASH asked the audience how many of them had read the autobiography of Malcolm X. He considers the text one of the most important for Muslims to read. AIYASH said Islam was preserved in America through the resilience of enslaved people, despite efforts to prevent them from practicing their faith through prayer, reading, and gathering. He said Black folks that came here as Muslims were stripped of their Islam. AIYASH said the 9/11 terrorist attacks shifted the perspective of the representation of Islam in America. The U.S. Supreme Court on Tuesday rejected former President Donald Trump's request to block the release of White House records to the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack. The committee has already received some records from the National Archives. It will be able to continue its investigation, but without those records, Trump reportedly tore up and/or flushed down White House toilets. The court rejected Trump's claim invoking executive privilege, Reuters reports. Trump has no legal authority to invoke the claim, as he is not the current president. President Joe Biden has repeatedly rejected Trump's claim as well. Biden has urged the National Archives to act quickly to release Trump White House records. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit dismissed a challenge Friday to Governor Larry Hogan's 2017 executive order banning government contractors from boycotting Israel. Plaintiff Saqib Ali argued this requirement violated his First Amendment right to free speech. The appellate court upheld the lower court's finding that Ali did not have standing because his bid was not rejected due to his support for anti-Israel movements. Ali argued he could not in good faith sign a portion of the bid that required applicants to swear they had not discriminated against subcontractors affiliated with Israel. The court also assessed Ali's boycotting actions to determine whether they fell within the executive order's anti-boycotting provisions. A Canadian teacher is suing a major Israel lobby group for defamation. On January 10th, Javier Davila and his attorneys announced that they had filed a lawsuit against B'nai B'rith and its chief executive, Michael Mostyn, under the country's Libel and Slander Act. Davila is a social justice educator and equity program advisor with the Toronto District School Board. His job is to provide educators with resources on combating racism and oppression. During Israel's attacks on Gaza last year, Davila emailed teachers information on Palestinian rights. That included a resource guide explaining the difference between criticism of Israel and its state ideology Zionism and anti-Jewish bigotry. But Davila was smeared in 3 separate columns in the right-wing Toronto Sun tabloid and by B'nai B'rith, an anti-Palestinian lobby group. Pressured by supporters of Israel in Canada, the Toronto School Board suspended Davila and launched an investigation against him. Following his suspension, teaching unions and nearly 5,000 students, educators, and community members signed a petition demanding his reinstatement and protection against the Israel lobby's attacks. A letter was also sent to the school board by Jewish parents who warned of a chilling effect on speech related to Palestinian rights issues. Davila was ultimately reinstated last July and did not face any formal discipline. We're bringing more news stories after the break, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Friends, our world is pulling together like never before. We're making huge sacrifices to keep one another safe. Scientists are working non-stop to develop COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. A vaccine will get our economies moving. It will tell our loved ones we're safe again. But we have challenges we must address. Right now, huge pharmaceutical companies are keeping the vaccine research a secret. They're deciding how many vaccines get made, how much to charge for them, and who gets vaccinated. This will no doubt leave billions of people behind. Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. Yet, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is funding their work. We cannot let the CEOs of a handful of pharmaceutical companies decide our future. We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us. To end this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to pull together once more.
The United Nations slammed baby formula makers on Wednesday for unethical marketing strategies. The UN accused manufacturers of aggressively targeting expecting parents and health workers and putting shareholder interests before children's health. According to a new report, countries have failed to crack down on the marketing of breast milk substitutes. The report found the $55 billion formula milk industry systematically deploys aggressive marketing strategies, spending up to $5 billion yearly. Too many children are still being reared on formula, the World Health Organization and the UN Children's Agency UNICEF warned. Experts say breastfed children are healthier, perform better on intelligence tests, and are less likely to be overweight or suffer from diabetes later in life. Women who breastfeed are also at reduced risk of breast and ovarian cancer, research shows. A drone attack by Yemen's Houthi rebel group that injured 16 civilians in Saudi Arabia this week has kicked up a storm of condemnation in the Arab world. The Saudi-led coalition said a drone attack targeted King Abdullah Airport in Jizan province, but was intercepted by Saudi air defenses. The Yemeni Foreign Ministry condemned the Houthi attack as a war crime and a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and international norms. Egypt said rebel attacks targeting Saudi airports represent a blatant threat to the security and stability of the kingdom and to the safety of civilian aviation and freedom of air navigation. The United Arab Emirates called on the international community to support measures to stop the Houthi militia from targeting civilian objects. Yemen has been engulfed by violence and instability since 2014, when Houthi rebels captured much of the country, including the capital, Sana'a. A Saudi-led coalition aimed at reinstating the Yemeni government has worsened the situation. Mahmoud Dandar wants to leave Syria, but has a problem. The 75-year-old has no money. Dandar recalls the old days before protests and wars led to his country's collapse and crash of the national currency. Though Syria wasn't thriving then, he had work, his children had university degrees and decent futures, and food was always on the table. He said, all that is gone now, and we have fallen just like our currency. Raqqa is the former de facto capital of the self-proclaimed ISIS region. It is home to about 300,000 people who are now free, but many of the residents want to leave. At least 3,000 people left Raqqa for Turkey in 2021, according to a city official. Economic collapse, widespread unemployment, drought, and proliferation of criminal gangs have worsened the humanitarian crisis. Aminullah Bobby Shamroz oversees the Mosque Museum of Broken Hill, a remote mining city of 17,000 people with a rich Islamic history. Built in 1887, it is the oldest mosque in Australia. It was founded by the Afghan Cameleers, 2,000 to 4,000 camel drivers who came to Australia in the early 1800s from modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. They were part of Australia's first major wave of Islam, arriving after European settlers. Afghan camel drivers began arriving by sea at bustling ports. Between 1860 and 1930, around 20,000 camels were shipped to Australia. Of the 3 camel drivers who were the first to arrive in 1860, 2 were Muslim. The Cameleers carried supplies to settlers working the gold mines of Central Australia. Most of the Cameleers were Muslims who set up the country's first mosques. Dubai opened its Museum of the Future Tuesday. The 7-story structure is a hollow silver ellipse decorated with Arabic calligraphy quotes from Dubai's ruler. It is situated on Sheikh Zayed Road, the city's main highway. The building's striking facade was lit up by a colorful laser light show in the evening as crowds gathered outside to catch a glimpse. It was opened by Dubai's ruler Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, whose vision of the future has been credited as the driving force behind the museum. The museum's contents are yet to be revealed. It will exhibit design and technology innovations, taking visitors on a journey to the year 2071, according to organizers. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
I am what hunger looks like in America. I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch. Till September. I am a single father of 2 who works 3 part-time jobs, and that's still not enough to put food on the table. I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. To discuss the current situation of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the U.S. role, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. All the headlines are talking about conflict between Russia and the United States. It is about Ukraine. What is Ukraine, where it is, and why in the world 2 superpowers want to go to head-on with each other? So people are wondering, very few. Even Bernie Sanders is appreciative of President Biden's sanctions on Russia. Germany has taken action. Are these people going to go to war? How will it be like that? But there is a voice which is saying that we at the United States are at fault. How America will feel if Russia has bases in Canada or Mexico. That's how he addresses this question. America going or NATO going next to Russia. We have with us Professor David Gibbs, who is a professor of history at the University of Arizona, a historian. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us, what is this conflict all about?
Well, the main issue is and has always been NATO. The United States has been expanding NATO since the end of the Cold War. And, Russia insists this is a threat to its national security and an affront to its interests. Ukraine has been officially a candidate for membership since 2008, and Russia insists that they simply will not tolerate a Ukraine that is in NATO. And the United States insists that the Ukraine's eventual right to join NATO is non-negotiable. As far as I can tell, the US, at least officially, refuses to even negotiate on that issue. And so that's the basic point of contention. There's a long history to this. And the bottom line is that the United States made an agreement not to expand NATO and has violated that agreement repeatedly. And that's the main source of the problem. I could wait for another question, or should I go into that agreement now, or would you like to ask another question before I do that?
Sure. I mean, you can talk, but tell us, was it a real agreement in writing with the ink and paper, or is it just a general understanding?
It was it's an oral agreement, although it was a very strongly worded oral agreement um, that has very likely has legal standing. All right, oral agreements. There is a tradition of in law, including international law, of recognizing oral agreements and having them legally enforceable. All right, and so it's true this was an oral agreement, but it was an agreement. Or I think there's strong evidence to that effect. Specifically, what we have here is in 1990, in the very end of the Cold War, in the very end days of the Soviet Union, the United States Secretary of State James Baker said to Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, that the United States would commit to not expanding NATO 1 inch to the east, not expanding it into the formerly communist states of Eastern Europe. This was repeated again and again by US and also German officials. Just recently, the other day in the British archives, a new document was unearthed that demonstrated a meeting in 1991 that reaffirmed the 1990 agreement not to expand NATO. And this was a quid pro quo. You see, Germany was being reunified. East Germany was going to join West Germany. And the Soviet Union was in a position to block this at the Security Council. It had objections to the reunification of Germany, partly based on historical fear of the Germans. And so the United States proposed that if the Soviet Union would drop its objections to German reunification and allow it to proceed, the US would, as a concession, would agree not to expand NATO, would make a commitment not to expand NATO. The Soviet Union fulfilled its promise. It did not object to German reunification. Germany was reunified, and the US promptly began violating or laying plans to violate this agreement. And the US began laying out plans to expand NATO into the former communist states of Eastern Europe. And beginning in 1999, this was operationalized, and Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO, again, in violation of this agreement. And then, NATO began expanding to most, not quite all, of the former communist states of Eastern Europe, and also to the former Soviet states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And I think this is the main point of contention, a lot of Russian anger and bitterness about the US violation of this agreement. And yes, they do bring up the issue of how would the US feel if the United States were planning an alliance with the possibility of military bases in, let us say, Mexico. And everybody knows the United States would never allow that and would react to it pretty much the same way. Russia is reacting to the possibility, in fact, the near certainty, it would seem, more likelihood, of the Ukraine eventually joining NATO.
How come then, Professor Gibbs, people like Bernie Sanders, who is not a warmonger of any type, is happy with the sanctions of President Biden instead of raising this question, hey, we are violating an agreement?
I don't know. I don't know Bernie Sanders personally, so I can't speak for him. As a general point, I would say, speaking from my own point of view, Bernie Sanders was very path-breaking on domestic policy. He's also path-breaking on the Israel-Palestine conflict, at least in the American context. But in other areas of foreign policy, he was somewhat weaker. And honestly, I don't get the impression that foreign policy, with the exception of the Israel-Palestine question, has never really been his strong point, in my view. And I think we're seeing that now. I think he's taking a somewhat conformist perspective here. He's conforming to the general consensus, seeing Russia as the villain in this case. Even though I think Russia does have a case to make that they have legitimate grievances here and a legitimate basis for opposing Ukraine joining NATO.
Well, is it becoming a partisan issue? Because former President Trump says it's a brilliant move by Russia.
Not really. I mean, there have been a few outliers. There's some Republican-aligned commentators like Tucker Carlson have actually taken very strong positions against a war-like position on this issue.
Professor Gibbs, you being a professor of history, tell us a little bit, is Putin's claim that Ukraine is a part of Russia true?
Well, not really. Ukraine separated from the Soviet Union in 1991 as a separate state. I think when Putin says that, he means two things. In the first place, what he's referring to is that Ukraine is a very divided society. And, one hears about the Ukrainian people rising up against the Russians, only half of them really feel strongly about that. The eastern and the central and western part of Ukraine, which is Ukrainian speaking, they're very anti-Russian. That is true. But the eastern and southern portions, which are Russian speaking or bilingual, look more to Russia as their protector traditionally. All right. They're large parts of the Ukraine, okay, that do want to separate, remain separate from the Ukraine and join Russia or become independent states. And I think when Putin says that, Ukraine is an artificial country, that it's part of Russia, I assume he's referring to the Russian-speaking areas. I don't see any realistic prospect under any circumstances where Putin would invade or try to absorb all of Ukraine. That would be an extremely foolish thing for him to do. And I think he's being very careful. I think he knows what he's doing. He's acting step by step based on his interests, not with any kind of universally accepted moral principle, but in terms of what he sees as Russia's interests. And I think, again, none of this would be happening at all if the United States had never expanded NATO and never proposed Ukrainian membership for NATO. And there's one more detail to this that has to be noted. In 2014, Ukraine had an elected pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. And under Yanukovych, in fact, before 2014, Russia was not talking about, how, Ukraine is part of Russia or anything like that. What happened is that the United States helped overthrow Yanukovych. There was a coup against Yanukovych. He was driven out of office. And the United States clearly played at least some role, probably a major role in that overthrow. All right. And the Russians, again, deeply resent that as U.S. meddling in the affairs of neighboring countries. And so I think that's also part of the background that has to be noted here. Again, if you listen to the American news, if you listen to the major figures in both parties, one has the impression of a villainous Russia with maybe fangs and blood in its fangs and something like that, and an America with a halo over its head. And that's a gross caricature of what's happening here. The U.S. has a lot of responsibility for destabilizing this region. I would argue more than Russia.
Well, Professor Gibbs, what's the U.S. interest in destabilizing at the moment in this history?
I think after the end of the Cold War, the United States had a certain hubris, a certain incredible arrogance that there was no stopping it, and that it would project American power worldwide. And there should be no part of the world that would not be subjected to American power. It saw the end of the Soviet Union as a unique opportunity to establish a kind of unilateral American hegemony with no challenge, all right? And NATO has always been one of the premier instruments of American power. And so expanding NATO as an instrument of US power was a priority, all right? In addition, there were vested interests in the United States and in Western Europe, I should add, including weapons manufacturers and also the uniformed militaries on both sides of the Atlantic, which benefit from the expansion of NATO. A former US admiral once said in the early 90s, the reason you're getting calls for expanding NATO is because generals and admirals like it. It's good for experience. It's good for new assignments, for advancement in the ranks. And so you have this combination of US power and arrogance and vested interests who are actively lobbying, I should add, in a direct sense for NATO expansion because they benefit from it. None of this has anything to do with global security. In reality, NATO has been nothing but an insecurity generating machine since the end of the Cold War. Its only historic function since 1990 has been to generate insecurity, which is what it's doing now.
Professor Gibbs, how far do you see this thing going between conflict, which is about Ukraine, but it is no longer between Russia and Ukraine? It seems to be directly Russia, United States, and NATO and the Western powers. How far do you see it going? I'm
very surprised. I'm very surprised it went this far. Initially, I was thinking and hoping that the United States would find some way of giving a written guarantee to Russia not to expand NATO, which is what Russia has always wanted, on the condition that it stops basically arming rebels in the Donbas region and promoting separatism in the Donbas region of the Ukraine, which is destabilizing Ukraine. Again, Russia has always made it clear that's its main demand, and I assumed the US would just give in on that demand to diffuse the situation. I'm really quite surprised that American officials have not done that, because that would be such an easy way to diffuse the situation. And there does seem to be a certain, what I would view as recklessness here, from foreign policy officials who sound very smooth on TV, but they're not really very talented. And if listeners don't believe me on that, I would suggest you look at videos of the US evacuation from Afghanistan, which was extremely incompetent. And so we're not dealing here with a foreign policy leadership that has great skill or great caution or prudence. I think we're dealing with really marginally competent people who are quite reckless in their focus. And I think the way this is heading, unfortunately, is a new Cold War, not just with Russia, but with China. All right. The next step, and again, Putin is very careful. He's a chess player. He goes step by step. The next step would logically be an alliance with China, as well as such secondary countries as Iran, Cuba, a new axis of evil, if you will. All right. That's what's coming. And this is going to mean a new Cold War. And for someone like myself, who remembers quite well the old Cold War, it was a very dangerous, scary, and needlessly expensive experience with a lot of loss of life and always the danger of nuclear war. And I think it's a terrible idea to be heading down that road, but that is exactly the road we seem to be headed on. And every step of escalation makes it much harder to walk back and much harder to resolve. And I'm fearful we will soon be at the point of no return.
Professor Gibbs, you're presenting a perspective here on Muslim Network TV, which is not found on CNN and ABC and NBC and Fox and all these places. So why America is not thinking in the direction which you are talking about? Have you been very busy on television?
I've been doing a lot of radio interviews and some TV interviews. Not nationally. Well, I was on CBS TV, CBS radio, but mostly on very secondary, ones that are not the mainstream ones like CNN or MSNBC. All right. And I think generally what you're having here is a press blackout and alternative perspectives. I mean, there are people who are, more prominent in academia than I am who hold this view, like, for example, John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago or Stephen Walt at Harvard. The recently deceased, I'm sorry to say, Richard Cohen at Princeton. All of these people are very highly accomplished academics at leading schools. They've been largely frozen out of discussion on this topic because they're not saying the right thing. All right. And so there's only a very narrow perspective you're getting in the mainstream media on this for the most part, with few exceptions. One thing you are getting that is a source of optimism is the public. The American public is not at all supportive of what's going on. In political science, there's something called the rally around the flag effect, which is when there's a crisis internationally, the president's popularity spikes temporarily because, the public gets patriotic. That hasn't happened here. Biden's popularity has not spiked. It's very low. And all the indications are the public is not interested in doing this conflict with Russia. And it's more foreign policy elites who are interested in doing this, and elites in the media.
But Professor, you also know that, these type of Mearsheimer and your voices and all that, they are not reaching America. And pretty soon, people will, anytime drums of war or America takes a side in any conflict, generally people who do not understand the what were our promises in 90s to Khrushchev and things like that, they will all, for Gorbachev that is, they will all forget about it. They will come on the side of raising flag and stay with our troops. So don't you see there is a risk if information is not available to public?
Of course. I mean, obviously, what's going on in terms of reporting is really a travesty in the sense that the major outlets of information, including the print media, Washington Post, New York Times, there really is kind of a blackout on alternative perspectives here, even from the most established sources. There's only really one point of view being projected with no real critique of that point of view. And what's amazing is the extent to which there's very little discussion of how the United States has violated an agreement not to expand NATO. That's really quite extraordinary. But There you have it. I mean, this isn't entirely unprecedented. I mean, undoubtedly, one of the most accomplished figures in analyzing US foreign policy has always been Noam Chomsky. And he's always been, well, for the most part, frozen out of mainstream media long before this. So the media has always been very narrow. But I think the narrowness has gotten even worse on this issue of the US and Russia. It's gotten worse than it was during the Cold War.
Well, thank you so much, Professor David Gibbs, Professor of History at the University of Arizona, for enlightening our audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Back to Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.